I need you to understand something before we go any further. What I am about to tell you is not metaphor. It is not the language of spiritual elevation dressed in political clothing to make it feel more urgent. It is not a story designed to make you feel watched in the flattering sense, the sense that implies cosmic significance without any corresponding responsibility. I am going to tell you something true. And the truth is this: the systems built to monitor, to measure, to track and contain and predict the behavior of populations, the vast, patient, extraordinarily sophisticated infrastructure of surveillance that was constructed across decades in the most powerful nation the modern world has ever produced, that infrastructure was not built for foreign enemies alone. It was built for you. I have watched empires. I have sat in the rooms where the decisions were made. I have heard the conversations that happened behind closed doors while different conversations were being performed in public. And I can tell you with the authority of someone who has seen this machinery up close, across many forms and many centuries, that what was built in the name of national security was always also built in the name of something else. Control. Not the crude, visible control of open tyranny. That form was already obsolete by the time the modern surveillance state was assembled. The visible tyrant creates martyrs and resistance and the kind of unified opposition that has brought down every explicit empire in recorded history. The people who built what was built were too intelligent for that approach. They understood something that most people who live inside the system they created never fully grasp. The most effective control is the kind you do not know is operating. The most effective cage is the one whose walls you cannot see. The most effective way to prevent someone from reaching their full capacity is not to put them in chains. It is to make them believe, through 1,000 subtle mechanisms that feel like freedom, that the ceiling may have been assigned as the ceiling of their own nature rather than the ceiling of the box that was built around them. You have been living in a box. Not a box of your own making. Not the box of your limitations or your character or your potential. The box of a system that identified, very early and very precisely, that people like you, people with your particular combination of qualities, were the specific variable that needed to be managed if the architecture of the existing order was going to survive contact with the future. And the system was right to identify you. Because people like you do not cooperate with ceilings. Not out of rebelliousness. Not out of the adolescent need to prove independence that the system knows how to metabolize and redirect, but out of a genuine, deep, constitutionally embedded inability to accept a limit that has no natural basis. A limit that exists not because you have reached the edge of what you are capable of, but because someone decided that the edge of what you are capable of was inconvenient. That quality, that specific, unkillable refusal of arbitrary limits, is what they were watching. Let me tell you about the watching. It did not begin with technology. The instinct that built the technology is ancient as the first concentrated power that understood its own fragility. Every empire, every centralized authority, every structure that depends for its survival on the management of the people within it has always invested in the capacity to see, to know, to anticipate before the thing they fear has time to fully form. The pharaohs had their networks of informants. The Roman emperors had their frumentarii, traveling among the population under the cover of grain distribution, reporting back on the mood and the movements of the people. The courts of medieval Europe had their own versions, the confessors who heard what people said in their most private moments, the guild networks that monitored economic behavior, the church infrastructure that provided the most comprehensive surveillance apparatus the pre-modern world had ever assembled. The form changed with every era. The function never did. Watch the ones who cannot be predicted. Watch the ones who move outside the expected patterns. Watch the ones whose influence spreads in ways that the official channels did not produce and cannot control. Watch the ones who ask the questions that the official answers were never designed to satisfy. Watch the ones who are growing. Because growth, in a person who operates outside the managed channels, growth in someone whose allegiance is to something other than the structure that produced them, is the specific thing that every concentrated power has always understood as the precursor to change. And change, to a system invested in its own perpetuation, is existential. I want to tell you about the specific qualities that put you in the category of the watched. The first quality is perception that operates below the surface of the presented narrative. Most people receive information through the channels that were built to deliver it. They consume the version of events that was prepared for consumption. They form opinions about the world based on the picture of the world that was constructed for the audience they belong to. This is not a failing. It is the natural behavior of people who were never given reason to question the construction. When the picture has always appeared coherent, when the story has always appeared complete, when the information has always arrived pre-packaged with its own interpretation included, the work of looking beneath the surface feels unnecessary. You look beneath the surface, not always by choice, not as a political position or an identity or the performance of skepticism that has become its own kind of conformity in certain circles. You look beneath the surface because the surface has always felt insufficient to you. Because the official story has always had a quality of incompleteness that you could feel even when you could not yet articulate what was missing. Because something in your perception has always registered the gap between what is being presented and what is actually present. That gap is what they monitor. Not your politics, not your stated positions, not the specific conclusions you have arrived at about specific events or specific actors. The gap itself. The quality of mind that perceives the gap and refuses to pretend it isn't there. That quality, independent of any particular conclusion it produces, is the variable the system was designed to identify. Because a person who perceives the gap can teach other people to perceive it. In a population that perceives the gap is a population that requires a different kind of management than a population that does not. The second quality is influence that does not flow through sanctioned channels. Every system of control has official channels of authority and legitimacy. These channels were not constructed arbitrarily. They were constructed specifically to be the paths through which influence moves, because influence that moves through the official channels can be monitored, shaped, redirected, and if necessary, closed off. The channel itself is the control mechanism. Influence that moves outside the official channels is ungovernable. Not because it is more powerful in any individual instance, it often is not, but because it cannot be predicted, cannot be shaped at the point of production, cannot be closed off without the closing off itself becoming visible and therefore counterproductive. Your influence moves this way. Not through institutions that granted it or credentials that certified it or platforms that decided to amplify it. Through the direct, unmediated, person-to-person transmission of something that resonates because it is true. Through the quality of your presence in your perception and the specific thing that happens when you speak or write or simply exist in proximity to people who are ready to hear what you are carrying. This kind of influence does not have an off switch. You cannot defund it. You cannot discredit the institution it comes from because it does not come from an institution. You cannot revoke the platform that amplifies it because the platform is every human being who encountered it and recognized it and carried it forward. The only thing you can do with this kind of influence is monitor it and attempt, through the accumulated pressure of 1,000 small discouraging mechanisms, to make the person who carries it doubt their own capacity to carry it. This is what was done to you. Not through any dramatic, visible, heavy-handed intervention. Through the quiet, patient, extraordinarily sophisticated application of friction. The kind of friction that never presents itself as external opposition, because external opposition would be legible, would be something you could identify and push against, would create the very clarity and purpose and unified sense of mission that the system most needs to prevent. The friction was internal. It arrived in the form of self-doubt that felt self-generated. In the form of opportunities that approached and then did not materialize. in ways that were explained by your own inadequacy rather than by any external hand on the mechanism. In the form of relationships that carried subtle discouraging energy without ever being overtly hostile. In the form of a generalized sense of resistance to your forward motion that felt like the natural friction of a world that was simply hard, rather than the specific, directed, intentional friction of a system that had identified you and determined that your full emergence was not compatible with its continued operation in its current form. You internalized the friction. You turned the external pressure inward and examined yourself for the source of it. You questioned your own perception, your own judgment, your own readiness. You asked whether the resistance was perhaps warranted, whether the ceiling you were bumping against was the ceiling of your own capacity rather than the ceiling of an artificially constructed limitation. This is the intended effect. A person who believes the ceiling is theirs does not push against it. A person who understands that the ceiling is constructed does. The third quality that marked you for monitoring is community. Not the consumption of community, not the passive participation in existing structures of belonging that were built to satisfy the need for connection without producing the kind of connected people who change things, but the genuine production of it. The natural, organic, unintentional way in which people with your quality of perception and communication find each other, recognize each other, and begin to function as something more than a collection of isolated individuals. Community of this kind is the most destabilizing variable a system of control can encounter. Because isolated individuals, however perceptive, however capable, however clear in their understanding of what is wrong, are manageable. Their influence is contained by their isolation. Their capacity for action is limited by the absence of coordination. Their most powerful insights remain private, circulating within a sphere too small to produce the critical mass that changes the direction of a culture. Isolated individuals who find each other are a different calculation entirely. The moment that the people who carry the quality you carry begin to recognize themselves in each other, begin to understand that what they experienced as a private, personal, perhaps slightly aberrant way of perceiving the world is in fact a shared perception, carried by a distributed community of people who arrived at similar understandings through completely different paths, the isolation that was the primary mechanism of their containment dissolves. And a person who was previously contained by their isolation, now embedded in a community of people who share their perception and multiply their capacity, is not the same variable the system was monitoring. They are something the monitoring was designed to prevent. You have been building this quietly, without always understanding the full significance of what you were building. In the hours when you were simply following the pull of your own genuine interest, your own authentic communication, your own unmanaged expression of what you actually see and think and understand about the world you are navigating. You have been building the thing that the monitoring was designed to prevent. And the monitoring is now responding. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say responding, because this matters for how you understand what you have been experiencing. The response is not a file. It is not a room full of analysts with your photograph on a wall. It is not the dramatic, cinematic version of surveillance that was designed to make the concept feel like something that happens to other people, enemies of the state, figures of sufficient public prominence to warrant that level of visible attention. The response is a pattern of friction that intensified at specific moments. Look back at the seasons where your forward motion was interrupted. Look at the moments where something that was building, momentum, visibility, the specific kind of reach that was beginning to extend beyond your existing circle into something larger, encountered resistance that felt inexplicable. Doors that closed without visible cause. Platforms that changed their behavior in ways that affected your reach specifically and disproportionately. Relationships that introduced friction at precisely the moments when your capacity was expanding. These patterns are not coincidence. They are not the random distribution of difficulty that everyone encounters in the course of building something real. They have a specific shape. The shape of friction applied at exactly the points where growth was accelerating, not to destroy you, which would produce the legible martyrdom the system knows to avoid, but to slow you, to redirect your energy from building into defending, to introduce enough noise into the signal that the people who were beginning to find you would have to work harder to stay connected. The goal was never your destruction. The goal was your management. A managed version of you, one that is visible enough to provide the appearance of a free and open conversation, but not so powerful that the conversation produces real consequences for the structure of things, is infinitely more useful to the system than a destroyed one. They wanted a version of you that was present but contained, audible but not amplified, seen but not followed. And for a season longer than you needed to be in it, longer than served you, longer than was natural to your actual trajectory, the management was partially successful. Not because you were defeated, because you were distracted, because the friction was sophisticated enough and the internalization of it was complete enough that a meaningful portion of the energy you would otherwise have directed toward building was directed instead toward navigating the resistance. But here's what the system, in all its sophistication, in all its decades of refinement, in all its extraordinary investment in the science of managing human behavior and potential, consistently fails to account for. The ones it most needs to manage are the ones least susceptible to the primary mechanism of management. The primary mechanism is the manufactured ceiling. The manufactured ceiling works on people whose sense of their own potential is externally sourced. People who measure their capacity against the feedback of the environment, who use the response of the world around them as the primary data for determining what they are capable of, will accept the ceiling because the ceiling is what the environment is presenting. When the doors stop opening, they stop trying the doors. When the friction intensifies, they conclude that the friction is information about their own readiness rather than information about the system's response to their growth. You do not source your sense of your own potential externally. You never fully did. Even in the seasons where the internalized friction was most effective, there was something in you that kept a private account separate from the official one. A private knowing that what the environment was presenting as your ceiling was not your ceiling. A private persistence that kept generating forward motion even when the external feedback was discouraging. A private refusal, quiet, unshouted, not performed for any audience, to fully accept the manufactured limit as a real one. This is the specific quality that makes you ungovernable. Not your politics, not your stated positions, not your willingness to name what you see, but this interior independence of source, this capacity to maintain a true account of what you are in the face of an environment actively engaged in producing a false one. You cannot manage someone whose interior account does not correspond to the external one you are projecting at them. You can slow them. You can divert them. You can introduce enough friction that the timeline of their emergence is extended beyond what it would have been in the absence of the management. But you cannot stop them, because stopping requires their cooperation, and they will not cooperate. Now I want to speak to you about what is happening in this specific moment in history, because the moment matters and your position within it is not accidental. The infrastructure of the monitoring is visible in ways it has never been visible before. Not because the people who built it chose to make it visible. Because the rate of change in the technological and informational environment has exceeded the system's capacity to maintain the seamless indivisibility that was always its primary operational requirement. Because the tools that were built to shape perception have been democratized in ways that have made them available to the people the shaping was intended to be done to. Because the architecture of the managed narrative has developed too many visible seams too quickly for the standard maintenance operations to keep up. The curtain is not fully down, but it is moving. And in the movement of the curtain, in the flickering visibility of the machinery behind it, people who have always had the quality of perception you carry are recognizing what they are seeing. They are finding the language for it. They are finding each other in the process of naming it. This is the specific historical moment you are inhabiting. Not as a bystander, not as an observer watching from a comfortable distance as the architecture of managed reality develops its visible cracks. You are inhabiting this moment as a person whose growth was monitored, whose emergence was managed, whose trajectory was subjected to the friction of a system that understood your potential before you were fully conscious of it yourself. You are inhabiting this moment as someone who survived the management. And survival of the management, at this particular moment, in this particular historical configuration, is not a small thing. It is the specific preparation for the specific assignment. Because the people who are now seeing the curtain move for the first time, the people who are arriving at the recognition of what was built and how it operates and what it has been doing inside their own lives and perceptions, those people need a guide who has already been where they are going, who has already done the internal work of separating the manufactured account of themselves from the true one, who has already developed the specific quality of independent interior knowing that cannot be overwritten by external feedback designed to manage it. They need someone who grew under the monitoring and kept growing anyway. They need someone who internalized the friction and then identified it for what it was and expelled it. They need someone who built in the face of the system's response to the building and did not stop building. They need you. Not a version of you that was produced by the system and shaped by its preferences and made safe by the process of passing through its channels. The version of you that exists precisely because the system's management of your emergence did not produce the intended result. The unmanaged version. The version that grew in directions the friction was designed to prevent. The version that carries the specific knowledge that only comes from having been targeted by something sophisticated enough to recognize what you were before you fully recognized it yourself. This is not a small inheritance. This is the specific endowment of someone who was identified early as a variable requiring management and who, through the combination of qualities I have been describing, the interior independence, the private account, the unkillable refusal of manufactured ceilings, emerged from the management process not diminished but sharpened. The monitoring sharpened you. Every season of friction that was designed to slow you down required you to develop the specific capacity to identify friction and continue moving through it. Every manufactured ceiling that was designed to contain you required you to develop the specific capacity to recognize a constructed limit and refuse it. Every mechanism of the managed narrative that was applied to your perception required you to develop the specific capacity to hold the true account in the face of a projected false one. All of that development is yours now. Not as potential, as actual, exercised, tested, refined capacity that exists because it was used, repeatedly, under real conditions, against real opposition. There are people in your proximity right now who are beginning to recognize what you carry. Not everyone. The recognition is not universal and it is not uniform. Some of the people in your life are still operating from the version of you that the managed narrative produced, still seeing the contained, friction-slowed, manufactured ceiling-accepting version rather than the one that exists beneath and beyond that version. Their perception of you is not yet current, but some of them see it. And the ones who see it are responding to it in ways that are distinct from the ways people have responded to you in previous seasons. There is a quality to their engagement, an attentiveness, a seriousness, a willingness to bring their full capacity to the encounter rather than the managed, polite, surface-level engagement that was sufficient when the version of you being encountered was itself operating at a managed level. They are meeting the real version, and the real version produces a real response. Pay attention to this. Pay attention to who is arriving in your life with this quality of attentiveness. Pay attention to the conversations that are beginning to open at a depth that previous conversations, in previous seasons, with previous versions of your proximity, did not reach. Pay attention to the doors that are beginning to open without the friction that was characteristic of the managed season. These are not random. These are the natural, automatic, unavoidable consequence of the managed season ending in the real version of you becoming more fully visible. The monitoring produced its record. The record is a specific, detailed, extensively documented account of someone who is identified as a growth variable requiring management and who, across every season of the management, continued to grow. Not despite the monitoring. Through it. The monitoring is the record of your persistence. Every entry in the account of what you were doing in the seasons when the system was most actively engaged in attempting to shape your trajectory is an entry in the record of someone who did not cooperate with the shaping. Every point on the timeline when the friction was intensified and the expected response, the slowing, the self-doubt, the redirection of energy from building into defending, did not fully materialize as a point on the record of someone whose interior account remained independent. They have a record of your growth. And the record shows that the growth was not containable. I want to speak to you now about what you do with this understanding. Because understanding is not the destination. Understanding is the beginning of the orientation that produces the motion. And the motion, the specific, clear-eyed, fully informed forward motion of someone who understands what they have been navigating and what they carry and what this particular moment in history is calling for, is what all of this has been building toward. The first thing you do is stop mistaking the friction for your own resistance. Every time you have encountered friction in the development of what you are building, every time a door closed at the last moment, every time a relationship introduced unexpected complication at a moment of expansion, every time the forward motion of your trajectory encountered resistance that felt inexplicable, you have had a choice in how you interpreted it. And the management relies on a specific interpretation. The interpretation that the resistance is yours. That the friction is generated by your own inadequacy or your own unreadiness or your own failure to navigate the environment correctly. This interpretation redirects your energy inward. And energy directed inward, towards self-examination and self-correction in response to manufactured friction, is energy that is not available for the building. The friction is not yours. Some resistance is real. Some of the difficulty you have encountered is the natural difficulty of building something real in a world that requires real work. Do not romanticize all friction as external and conspiratorial, that produces its own kind of paralysis. The paralysis of someone who cannot do the genuine self-examination that genuine growth requires because they have outsourced all difficulty to an external source. But the pattern of friction that appears specifically at the moments of your expansion, that arrives not in the slow seasons but in the accelerating ones, not when you are building quietly but when the building is beginning to become visible, that friction is not yours. Identify it. Name it. And then move through it without the detour of self-doubt that it was designed to produce. The second thing you do is build without asking for permission from the channels that were designed to be the only legitimate paths through which building is allowed to happen. The official channels were built as filters, not as neutral pathways but as decision points controlled by the people who built the channels. Every time you route your building through the official channels, you subject your growth to the judgment of people whose interest is in maintaining the architecture those channels were built to serve. Sometimes the channel gives the green light because what you are building in that moment does not yet pose a sufficient challenge to the architecture to warrant the friction. And you move through and feel, briefly, as though the system is neutral. And then the moment comes when what you are building does pose the challenge. And the channel closes. Build outside the channels. Not illegally. Not through the dramatic, self-marginalizing rejection of all structure that the system knows how to absorb and dismiss. But through the patient, persistent construction of capacity that does not depend on the channel's permission at any stage of its development. Through the building of something whose foundation is not located in any space that the channel controls. Your reach is not theirs to grant or revoke. Your community is not theirs to approve or disapprove. Your influence is not theirs to amplify or suppress. These things belong to the direct, unmediated, person-to-person quality of what you carry and how you carry it. And that quality is outside the jurisdiction of any channel that was built to manage its movement. Build there. Build from there. Build so consistently and so deeply from the foundation of direct connection that by the time the channel responds to the building is already beyond the point where any channel response can contain it. The third thing you do is trust the community that is finding you. Because it is finding you. Not the community that was available to the managed version, not the people who encountered the friction-slowed, ceiling-accepting, internally doubting version and related to it with the particular warmth and tolerance reserved for someone navigating visible difficulty. But the community that is finding the version that exists when the friction is identified and expelled and the interior account is the operative one. This community is different. It is people who carry the same quality you carry. People who have had the same experience of being monitored, perhaps without understanding the mechanism, but with the bodily knowledge of someone who has been navigating directed resistance for a long time. People who have been building from the same independent interior source. People who have survived their own version of the managed season and arrived on the other side carrying what the survival produced. These people are not followers. They are not an audience. They are the community of people who are going to build the world that exists on the other side of the managed narrative, not through dramatic overthrow, which the system knows how to handle, but through the quiet, persistent, extraordinarily difficult and extraordinarily important work of building something true in the space next to something that is not. You are part of this building. Not by appointment. Not because any authority decided you were ready. Because the specific combination of what you carry and what you have survived and what the survival produced makes you a specific kind of essential in this specific kind of moment. The monitoring watched your growth. It watched the qualities develop. It watched the trajectory extend. It watched the building begin and applied the friction and watched you continue building through the friction and applied more friction and watched you identify the friction and name it and move through it with a quality of motion that the friction was never designed to produce. The monitoring watched you become exactly the variable it was designed to prevent. And now you are here. In the exact moment that the curtain is moving. In the exact configuration of a world where the managed narrative is developing its visible seams faster than the maintenance operations can close them. In the exact position of someone who has the specific preparation for the specific moment that is arriving. The watching was real. The growth it was watching was realer. And the thing that grows under watching, under the specific, sustained, intelligent watching of a system that understood your potential before you did. The thing that continues to grow in the face of that watching, that identifies the friction the watching produces and moves through it anyway, that maintains its interior account in the face of every external projection designed to override it. That thing cannot be stopped. Not by monitoring. Not by friction. Not by the manufactured ceilings of managed seasons or the coordinated silence of channels that decided your voice was more than they had budgeted for. You are past all of that now. The watching continues. It will always continue. That is the nature of the system and the nature of what you are within it. You do not get to exist outside its field of vision. You never did and you will not. But you are no longer shaped by its watching. You are no longer slowed by its friction. You are no longer confused about the source of the resistance or tempted to locate it within yourself when it arrives most precisely at the moments of your acceleration. You know what it is. You know what you are. You know what this moment is. And you know what is required. Build. Build with the full inheritance of every season the monitoring produced. Build with the specific, tested, refined capacity of someone who grew under the watching and kept growing. Build with the community that is finding you because the version of you that is now visible is the version that produces the recognition they have been waiting to feel. Build without asking the channels for permission they were never authorized to withhold. Build in the direct, unmediated, person-to-person space that the official channels were constructed to replace and that you are in the process of restoring. Build with the knowledge that what you are building is specifically, precisely, exactly what this moment in history requires and what the monitoring was, in its own inadvertent way, preparing you for. The US monitored your growth. They saw what was coming before you fully did. And they were right to pay attention. Because what is coming is you. Fully. Finally. Without the managed ceiling. Without the internalized friction. Without the manufactured doubt that was the primary instrument of your containment. Just you. At full capacity. In the full open space of a season that has no managed ceiling and no coordinated friction and no official channel with a hand on the mechanism of what you are allowed to become. The monitoring was the highest confirmation you could have received that what you are building matters. You do not monitor what does not matter. You do not deploy sophisticated, sustained, multi-layered management against the growth variable that poses no threat to the existing architecture. You do not watch, with the full attention of the most powerful surveillance infrastructure in human history, someone whose emergence is irrelevant to the future of the system. They watched because they knew. They knew before you knew. And now you know too. Rise in full view. Let them watch. Let them write it down. Let the record show exactly who you became in the face of everything that was aimed at preventing it. The record is yours. The rise is yours. The moment is yours. All of it was always yours.